Okay, welcome. And we are delighted to be welcoming my colleague, Daniel Weiner. Dan Weiner serves as the director of the Brennan Center's Election and Government Program, where he leads work on money in politics, voting in elections, government ethics, and other democracy and rule of law issues. Welcome, Dan. Nice to have you.
I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you, and we will just get started. So we know that you've been doing a lot of work on this issue of corruption, and one of the things that Americans seem to appear united on is their belief that corruption is a problem in both parties. Can you tell us what kind of corruption Americans are worried about, and is this truly a bipartisan problem?
Sure. So one thing people might be interested in is we recently put out actually a public poll, and the Brennan Center has started doing more of these recently. We actually have a very, very large research department, and we focused in this poll on attitudes around political corruption, and the results really were striking. And this issue has been polled before, but we wanted to get at some angles of it that were a little different or distinct from what other public polls have looked at. And so what it found, one was that political corruption is a huge concern for Americans. Upwards, more than 90% of respondents across both parties said that it was a major problem. And actually, more than 60% said it was an extremely big problem. Now, what that poll, if you break down some of the details, showed us was very interesting. So one thing, it's not just that people see corruption as a big problem, but one, they define corruption broadly. Sometimes you hear lawyers or other sort of technical experts say that corruption means, just sort of quid pro quo bribery or some other criminal activity. But that's not really what Americans, by and large, seem to think. Americans really seem to think that corruption can extend to the undue influence of billionaires and big corporations in our political system. They think that it certainly encompasses profiting off one's government service, whether that is legal or not. And I think one of the more interesting things is they also think of corruption as encompassing things like the waste of taxpayer dollars or the use of government resources, for programs and policies that don't benefit the public. And that has lessons, I think, certainly for conservatives who have tended to discount to some degree, the harms of undue influence for billionaires and corporations. It also, though, does have lessons for progressives because Americans do see waste of public resources, fraud on public programs as a form of corruption, and they're very concerned about that. The other thing that I really want to emphasize is the extent to which that Americans connect the issue of corruption to what we sometimes call kitchen table issues, as an expression. Issues like affordability, taxes, the things that people really do talk about and see as affecting their daily lives. People think corruption is very, very connected to these issues. They think corruption is the reason they don't receive top quality government services. They think corruption is the reason that the government doesn't prioritize the things that they most care about. So it is both an incredibly salient issue for Americans, and it is an issue that is very connected to the concerns people have about the economy, about jobs, and the things that sort of touch on their daily lives.
I love that term, table issues is very interesting. Dan, thank you for being here with us and tell us a little more about what is happening here in the United States. To explain us a little more, this second Trump administration has many accusations of corruption, yet Congress hasn't taken up serious policy recommendations to counter what we are experiencing. People here, the borders in the United States. How has the system work or fail, in your opinion?
It's such an interesting question, and you have to sort of understand a little bit the history of the United States here, and the Americans' relationship to their government. So, um, for many years, you could say that the American system was relatively free of what we might have thought of as the sort of traditional forms of corruption, sort of, looting of the government, right? That was very common in the Gilded Age in the 19th century, but as government kind of became more professionalized, that became much rarer. What replaced it was a sort of a more systemic type of corruption that came from really mostly unregulated money in elections. So starting in the mid 20th century, people started spending more and more on elections, and the law didn't really regulate that, and that created, circumstances where you could have undue influence over politicians through that avenue. And of course, that became much, much worse after the United States Supreme Court and Citizens United and other decisions struck down what regulations we did have starting about 15 years ago. And the law has not really dealt with that problem. So since Citizens United, the Congress has failed to do really anything to push back against the court's decision. Now, and that is still, an enormous problem. Elon Musk, for instance, poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the 2024 presidential campaign, and that was largely unregulated money. And you don't see that in many other countries where you can have an oligarch like that just spend so much money directly on an election. Certainly not in other countries that would consider themselves sort of advanced democracies. Now, in the second Trump term, though, we have something interesting, which is we have that unregulated system of campaign money, and it has combined with a resurgence of what we might think of as a sort of more traditional version of just self-enrichment by those who rank highly in government. That is certainly something that has characterized President Trump's second term. And most of what he is doing is legal, we should emphasize, but he has really leveraged, the presidency, right, to enrich himself, most notably through his crypto businesses. But it's certainly not limited to him. You also have a market uptick, for instance, in members of Congress trading stock, apparently on non-public information and enriching themselves that way. You have, government-wide, in some ways, a sort of abandonment by many figures, not all, but many, of this ideal of public service as a public trust that shouldn't be used to enrich oneself. You also saw that, frankly, a little bit with the family of former President Joe Biden. And his son Hunter, who made a lot of money, arguably trading off connections from his father. So you have our unregulated campaign finance system, but then you have the convergence with this older form of corruption that has really resurged. And it's kind of a perfect storm now. And there's a sense, I think, growing, and our poll certainly showed that by the supermajority of Americans, that government really isn't working for them. And because government seems to be serving more the interests of the rich and powerful. And of course, at the Brennan Center, we think that this is a very dangerous situation for democracy, because it is directly fueling a sense, I think, by too many Americans that democracy isn't working for them. And that's something none of us should want.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. And given this perfect storm, there's like a list, I guess, of weather conditions that have made it so. What would you say is the one that is most worrying to you of the corrupt actions committed by Trump and his allies? Which is the one? I mean, there's so many to pick from, but which would be the one?
Well, when it comes to President Trump, I think what I most worry about is there are many things that obviously I've criticized, and I really want to emphasize, though, this is not just about President Trump, but the degree to which the business of the government has become intertwined with his personal interests, which is something that we have seen in other countries. Certainly, I mean, it calls to mind Kirchnerismo in Argentina, or how Silvio Berlusconi behaved in Italy. It is not something that we are used to seeing in the United States. But what worries me is not just the fact of that sort of behavior, it's the resetting of values and of what we sometimes call norms of government service, because that sets a tone for the rest of the government. And what's interesting, compared to past administrations, right, and to what we would call a scandal. A scandal in the United States, a corruption scandal, has typically been something that was hidden and that was revealed, and there was a lot of controversy around it, and then there were consequences or not. What is different here is this attempt to reset values and this idea that actually it is perfectly fine to profit off government service, that everybody profits off government service, that government service exists in order to help people enrich themselves. That is a very dangerous road to go down. And as we have seen in many other countries around the world, in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, it is incredibly destabilizing for a political system when that becomes normalized. So if I had to say what worries me most about the Trump era, it's that. It's this idea that we were moving into an era where the presidency, which is also more powerful than it has been in any time in living memory, thanks in part to Supreme Court decisions that have swept away constraints on the president's power, is the idea that the presidency can be a sort of extension of a president's personal self-interest. That's not a road that I think many of us want to go down, but that is the road we seem to be going down right now.
It seems like it's some kind of subtle actions, like it's difficult to explain or in particular cases. But you recently published a paper with colleagues explaining 9 solutions for political corruption. However, many options, such as a constitutional amendment to restore campaign finance laws, seem out of reach. What are the smaller steps that can be taken to address corruption? And most importantly, can ordinary citizens do anything?
So that's a very interesting question. And I guess I would push back a little bit at the idea that these sort of big steps are out of reach. Because in our poll, we also polled a number of these solutions. And what's interesting is, they're supported by upwards of 80, in some cases, 90% of the public. So, in a very polarized climate, even things that we would consider, very, very big solutions like amending the US Constitution to restore limits on money in campaigns, that polls at almost 80% support from the public. So these are and across all regions, also across different political ideologies. So I do think these things are attainable. They're not the only thing. So we intended in that document to sketch out the sort of big ideas that we think should animate what is likely at some point, I hope, to be an era of major reform, right? And that is the trend in American history, right? Is that eras of corruption are followed by eras of reform. And those eras of reform tend to be big. They're not small ball. There are, of course, many other things that can be done that are not as ambitious, although I think you need to focus on the ambitious things. But there are many common sense reforms to campaigns that could be enacted now, for instance, requiring more transparency in campaigns. In the United States, it's not just that so much money is going in, it's also that an increasing amount of that money comes from sources that we don't know, right, that are undisclosed. You could require, in the very least, that all money in campaigns be disclosed. You could require, that members of Congress refrain from trading stocks. That is something that has broad bipartisan support that has been put forward in the Congress. It seems to have a lot of support, so they could get that done. I think when you ask what ordinary citizens can do, because this is very important, it depends on who you are as an ordinary citizen. Certainly, if you are someone who is politically active, I think one of the most important things you can do actually is in your interactions with elected officials and policymakers, you can make clear that you care about these issues, that you want them to be prioritized. I think there is a sense on the part of many elected officials, not just elected officials at the national level, but also at the state and even the local level, that these sorts of concerns are not really what voters most care about, that they most care about, taxes or affordability. The reality, though, that we're seeing is that those things like taxes, affordability are very connected to the issue of corruption. So you can make clear to your elected officials that this is something you care about, that you want them to prioritize. And then, frankly, you can vote that way. You can say, like, this is an issue that I'm going to use, and I don't care who you vote for. We at the Brennan Center, we're nonpartisan, but you should vote for the people who are promising to prioritize these issues, whatever party they come from. So I think that is something that's very important you can do. I think you can get involved with many organizations in your communities that work for cleaner government. In almost every state, there's an organization. You can donate to it. You can volunteer to work for it and to provide services. And I think also just generally educating yourself. I mean, again, I am struck by in an era when there is so much disinformation out there. There is so, a cacophony of information coming at you over social media that having reliable information, particularly coming from those we know and trust, is so important. So it matters how you show up with your family, your friends, your colleagues, what information you're sharing, and keeping people focused not on, disinformation, not on internet rumors, but on the issues that really matter for our political system, including not just that this or that politician is corrupt, but that we really need to do something about it. That it's not just an attack that we level against a public figure we don't like, but it's really a call to change our system. And I think that's where we get lost sometimes. We focus a lot on, calling someone who we don't like corrupt. We don't really focus on what to do about it. And it's not enough, I think, to just vote out a politician you don't like. You actually need to have safeguards in the system to ensure that no matter who's in charge, the government works for all of us.
Great, thanks, Dan. And this is our last question. The U.S. has faced different periods of corruption, but this period seems different. What are the implications for U.S. democracy and its institutions, including the judicial power, for instance?
And we didn't talk very much about the Supreme Court, but in our poll, people also called the Supreme Court corrupt. And I think the fact that, for instance, the Supreme Court doesn't even have an ethics code that's binding on it is kind of a scandal and something that they should be compelled to do, right, at a very minimum. But what I think is that, and we've looked at the research on this, rampant corruption is very dangerous for democracies because it creates a kind of very, very perilous feedback loop where people see corruption, they lose faith in democracy, then they become less engaged in public affairs. And then they tune out, and that actually allows corruption to become worse. And it reinforces a culture of impunity, which then in turn further sort of depresses voter turnout and makes people lose faith in the system. So what I think is that, and this is how in some ways these corruption issues fit into the other issues the Brennan Center works on. We want everyone to have access to the ballot box. We want people to be able to participate in democratic systems. But then we also want them to have at least some reason to have faith that when they make their voices heard, those in power will listen. And it's very much integrated as part of the process. In the United States, at least, we do struggle with access to the ballot box, people actually being able to vote, but we've made a lot of progress, and I hope we'll be able to maintain that. Where we really, I think, need to worry right now with our system is this idea that once people vote, that vote will matter, that will actually result in policies that are reflective of what the voters want. And I think that is ultimately why this issue is so important and why we need to consider it in tandem alongside the direct issue of who can participate in our elections. And so that's why for the Brennan Center, long term, this is such an important emphasis for us because we want a democracy in which Americans have confidence, and we want a democracy that's actually going to respond to what the voters want and frankly, what are their priorities.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Jesus, do you have any follow-up additional questions?
No, that's amazing. I think we have as much as we can have at this time because the time is difficult. Right. Daniel Weiner, Director of Elections and Government at the Brennan Center for Justice. Thank you for helping us to explain a little more what is happening in the United States with this issue.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.